What we do is, my name's Joe Fitzgerald, and I'm the author of The Struggle is Eternal, Gloria, Richardson, and Black Liberation. And as you probably already know, that my scholarship focuses on Miss Richardson and her leadership of the Cambridge movement, which was, she led that movement in Cambridge, Maryland from 1962 to 64. And today I'm joined by my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Daryl Mace. And Daryl and I, we met at Temple University Graduate School. He was in the history department, I was in the Black Studies department. And that was almost 20 years ago when we met.
Yeah.
So we've been friends a long time.
Yeah.
And some of our scholarship interconnects because he focuses also on civil rights. We work at Cabrini University in Radnor, which isn't far from here. And Daryl's book on Emmett Till, specifically about the coverage, the media coverage of the trial of Emmett Till's murderers. What's the name of your book, Daryl?
So it's In Remembrance of Emmett Till, and it's regional stories and media responses to the Black freedom struggle. And so it's also the University of Southwest Kentucky publication, came out in 2014.
Right, and it's also available here at the bookstore.
Mm-hmm.
What's your current project?
So right now I'm working on a biography of Rosa Parks, and they're interesting. There are a few biographies that are out there of Rosa Parks. Jean Theoharis has a really excellent book on Rosa Parks, and she has her own autobiography. But what I'm doing now is actually working on a book that's geared specifically to high school students and college students, so to make it really accessible to them and to really bring to light kind of the entirety of Rosa Parks' life. So we know Rosa Parks, for December 1955, she refuses to give up her seat on the Montgomery bus line, but she has a long history of activism, and really up until her death, she was engaged in civil rights, Black liberation efforts. So just teasing that all out.
Okay, cool. So today Daryl and I will cover, I guess more folks coming in. Hey, come on in.
Come on in.
I saw them next door.
Did you?
Yeah, come on in. Don't be shy, we're still friends, okay?
Sorry, I just wanted to peek my head in.
Okay.
Okay.
So today we'll cover 3 specific topic areas regarding Gloria Richardson. And Daryl and I will pass the mic, so to speak, between each other as we talk about Richardson. And he'll tie Rosa Parks into these broader topic areas of Gloria Richardson's life. So, and I think that what we'll be able to do is demonstrate how Gloria Richardson and Rosa Parks' activism and views of liberation and the process by which people can go about working for liberation can actually be employed currently, today, by today's activists. So the reason why we've teamed up here is that philosophically, I believe that being a white person, writing about and studying about a black person, that if I'm going to be in a public space talking about somebody like Gloria Richardson, then there needs to be a nothing about us without us. And nothing about us, meaning the us being black people, and that there needs to be a black person present to be able to piggyback off this conversation, that it's not this dynamic of a white scholar talking about black people in an abstract or way like that. So first I'll discuss Richardson's family and her childhood and how her family was important to her personal development and some of her early work in her race service or service to her race. And then Daryl will discuss Parks' childhood and family. And we'll be able to see points of convergence between the two people and what that means to us as far as scholarship, but also as activists, if we're so inclined to be that. And the second thing I'll do is I'll provide you with a snapshot of Gloria Richardson's importance to the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. And the third thing, which is pretty much related to the second, is I'll discuss leadership. This is what's so important to Miss Richardson's story, as you'll be able to tell when you read through her biography. And once I present this story about black leadership as Richardson demonstrates it, Daryl will talk about Miss Parks' importance to the civil rights movement and Black Power, and also her views on leadership. And some of what I'll present today is actually taken directly from my biography of Miss Richardson. But I made some stylistic adjustments so that when I'm reading it, it sounds a little better in person. So let me talk about my social location. I'm a white guy in Black Studies. My bachelor's is in Black Studies, my master's is in Black Studies, and so is my PhD. I earned my PhD in Black Studies at Temple. And I'm drawn to Black Studies because I grew up in a household where my mother wanted me to be a part of the solutions of the world and not to be a part of the problem. And Black Studies as an academic discipline is problem-driven and solution-oriented. It's not just enough to name the problems that Black people face or that affect people of African descent. We have to be creative about thinking about the solutions to those problems. And that we know that because white supremacy is created by white people have to be involved in the solution aspect of it. So I found that Black Studies was a natural fit for my own upbringing, that I need to be a part of the solution to problems of the world. And I was drawn to Black Studies specifically because I took some coursework in the civil rights movement, and it really captured my attention that the people of the 1950s and 60s, the modern Black liberation wave of Black freedom, that they were employing rhetoric of Christianity, of liberation of the soul in the afterlife and liberation of the body in the here and now. So that spoke to my heart and head because I was raised in a Christian household that really emphasize the importance of not only having a saved soul, but also of making the world a better place for people in the here and now. Okay? So that's how I come to Gloria Richardson and Black Studies. So let's move on to the story of Gloria Richardson. So she was born in 1922 in Baltimore, Maryland, and her family, she's still alive. She's going to be 97 in May, okay? She was raised in a family where they expected her to be a servant to her race, to her community. In whatever capacity she was able to do that. They didn't necessarily think she was going to be a leader, but they prepped her for that kind of service should that be it. And they really wanted her to be an advocate for the Black community and to be an advocate for Black people because she came from both her maternal family in Cambridge, Maryland, and her paternal family from the south side of Virginia, which is the southern region of the state of Virginia. They were highly successful entrepreneurs. Her father's family was a farming family. They owned 100 acres of land, a Black family with 100 acres of land near the end of the 1800s, okay, which is not all that common for most Americans, but particularly for Black Americans, especially after Reconstruction. And her maternal family came from a line of free Black people who owned lots of shops in Cambridge, Maryland. Butcher shops, grocery stores, a funeral parlor, mom and pop shops. And because her family lived so well, because of Black residents' patronage of those family businesses, Miss Richardson's family socialized her to return the favor and serve her Black community because her elders told her, we live as well as we do because of the Black people in these communities that patronize our businesses. We wouldn't have this standard of living were it not for them. So we're supposed to do what we can for them. That was the message her family gave her. So she took that to heart. Then she went on to study sociology at Howard University. She began attending there in 1938 at the age of 16, and she graduated in 1942 with her degree in sociology. And her professors essentially trained her the same way, to be a servant to the Black race. So some of these names of her professors is a who's who of American intelligentsia in general, but particularly for Black America, these names you may have heard these names. E. Franklin Frazier, the sociologist, okay? Rayford Logan, the historian. Alain Locke, the philosopher. Ralph Bunche, who's Miss Richardson's political science professor. He also won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1948, I think it was.
48, I believe, yeah.
For negotiating the treaty that ended the conflict between the newly developed state of Israel and the surrounding Arab nations. He was her political science professor, and the English professor, Sterling Brown. Those are 5 giants of intellectualism in America, particularly for Black America, and they were her professors during these 4 years. So, what did they teach her? Well, particularly her sociology degree, she learned the skill of social research, particularly designing and administering a survey. And this becomes a big deal for her during the 1960s because she essentially she does create the needs-based assessment of the Black community in Cambridge, because she designs a survey, local people go out and administer the survey, and they take it back to Swarthmore College, which isn't far from here, and some of the social scientists at Swarthmore actually did all the correlations and analysis of the data. So they generated a report that basically told Gloria Richardson and the rest of the activists in Cambridge what those big ticket items were that Black community people wanted to work on. Okay, so we'll get to that in a little bit. But before that even began, in the mid to late 1950s, Richardson begins this process of service to her race service. And this is a tradition within her family. She attends parent-teacher association meetings, she attends school board meetings, and she actually goes in front of the predominantly white city council. And Maryland is an interesting case in American history. Black people had never been denied the right to vote since the end of the Civil War. So Black men had the right to vote after the Civil War, and Black women got the right to vote during about 100 years ago with the passage of the 19th Amendment. So Black people had not been politically disenfranchised that way, as had been the case in most other southern states. So Cambridge actually did have one Black city council member on city council. So she goes to this city council board, and she actually does community advocacy for the Black community. She requested more funding for Black schools and extracurricular activities, and as well as enrichment programs that would improve the Black community's quality of life. So up until that point, so she's not in the civil rights movement per se at this point, but it gives you a snapshot of what her background was beforehand, and then pretty much right up until the beginning of that what we call that modern civil rights movement. So Daryl, can you fill us in on Miss Rosa Parks' family history, her childhood, education, and what her activism was before the Montgomery Bus Boycott?
Yeah, definitely. And I'll talk a little bit about how a lot of this dovetails, but then also there's kind of unique differences between the life of Rosa Parks and Gloria Richardson. But certainly Rosa Parks, like Gloria Richardson, learned a version of race service from her family. It's kind of what happens with these activists. Black female activists in particular are really grounded in the work that their family has taught them. She learned a lot of things from her maternal grandfather in particular. And one of the things is that kind of, I am a man, but in her version, I am a woman, or I am a human being, I'm a person. So she says, even in her autobiography, she realized at a really early age, I was a regular person, just as good as anybody else. That's a quote from. And one of these events that kind of happened to her that actually really was a formative moment happened in 1919. She was born in 1913, but in 1919, one of the white landowners that lived adjacent to her property came over, and he was there with his son-in-law. And 1919 is the year that, 1919 is a really important year, but we emerged out of World War I in 1919. And so Moses Hudson is there with his son-in-law, who was a soldier in World War I, and he was from the North. And he came over and he patted Rosa Parks on the head in a very caring way, not in a paternalistic way necessarily, as she describes it. But she says that he treated her like a child, not as a black child. So this white man is treating her like a human being, like an equal. And it had this indelible effect on Rosa Parks and her family. And it became part of a family narrative that they talked about all the time. And the person who really talked about it most was her maternal grandfather. And her maternal grandfather, a guy by the name of Sylvester, was just really intent on standing for his rights. He said, "You don't take anything from anybody." One of the kind of things that framed Sylvester's life is his father, his biological father, was actually the owner of the plantation where his biological mother was employed, if you will, forced into labor. And so he is a product of the rape of a white man raping a black woman. So this is Rosa Parks' maternal grandfather. And the woman, his mother, the woman that was a victim of this sexual abuse, was also herself of mixed race heritage. So Sylvester was very light skinned. So to the point where he could actually pass as white. And that led to a lot of abuse that Sylvester got once his biological father died. The overseer of that plantation, and we'll still call it a plantation even though it's after slavery, but the overseer on that plantation used to give him all kinds of abuse, starve him out, beat him, torture him, and so Sylvester didn't take anything from anybody. The events in his life left a mark on Rosa Parks because Sylvester, as her grandfather, instilled in her that she was not to put up with bad treatment from anybody. And she said, actually, it was passed down to her almost as if it was written into her genes, into her very fabric. It was written in, you don't take anything from anybody. You talk about Miss Richardson and her education. For Miss Parks, it's the same thing. Education was the key, a pathway to enrichment, freeing your mind. And so her family insisted that she go to school, and she loved school. She went to these schools of Mount Zion AME Church School, Alabama Normal School, Spring Hill Church School, Booker T. Washington Junior High, and those schools gave her a foundation in education, these kind of reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also all of these schools were segregated schools because her social location and geographic location is in Alabama, right? And so segregation is the name of the game in Alabama. Disenfranchisement is the name of the game in Alabama. And so she is taught by these educators, including her mother, who was an educator and who was her teacher at some of these schools. She was taught kind of empowerment of the race. And several of these schools are connected to black institutions, Mount Zion AME Church, Spring Hill Church. So the religion aspects, as you talked about, this kind of liberation theology, I'll say black liberation theology, is really, she's grounded in black liberation theology, that there is a salvation in the afterlife, but there's also that spiritual salvation in the afterlife, but there is a physical, corporal salvation that needs to be worked for in the here and now. And so she's taught that by her grandfather, by her mother. Her father's not necessarily in her life a lot, but her father also embodies a lot of these things. And because education is so important, she does have to drop out of high school in the 11th grade because her grandmother gets sick and her mother eventually gets sick. But she goes back and she gets her diploma in 1933 at the age of 22 because education to her was so important. And it leads really to her activism. And her activism really begins in 1931. So she's older. She's actually dating her soon-to-be husband, Raymond. And 1931, she gets engaged with this, actively engaged. She's intellectually engaged, but actively engaged in kind of black activism, liberation theology, black liberation theology with the Scottsboro Boys. And so the Scottsboro Boys, 9 African-American boys that are arrested for allegedly raping 2 white women on a train in 1930. And the accusation of rape, which is historically has been a pathway for white women to escape punishment, was levied against these 9 men by 2 women, Ruby Bates and Victoria Price, because they were arrested for what's called hoboing, riding the rails. They hopped a boxcar to get from one town to another, and they got arrested. And so in order to get away, or in order to be acquitted of the crime or not even charged of the crime, they accused 9 boys that were also hoboing of raping them. And so this case actually takes up the entirety of the 1930s. It's this long-standing case. 2 major Supreme Court decisions come out of it, but linked to this is the roots of Rosa Parks' activism. She sees the injustice and she goes to action because of this injustice, as does her husband, Raymond Parks.
And one of the women actually recants her.
And one of the, yes, Ruby Bates actually recants her. She recants her story on the stand. She goes on the stand and says, they didn't rape us, nothing actually happened, we just made this up. And they were still convicted. All 9 were convicted, and 8 of the 9 were actually sentenced to death. And I believe the last of the Scottsboro Boys was released from prison in 1941. So they spent the decade of and we're talking kids that are from the age of 15 to 21. So, you know, their formative years or really I had a lot of fun from 16 to 21. So like those years.
You've told me.
Yeah, I know. So those years of just like really being an adult and young adulthood and all that really.
And probably being sent to an adult prison.
And then they were sent to an adult prison. Yeah, and they were robbed of their freedom. Yeah.
Cambridge movement, which is why we know about Gloria Richardson. So the Cambridge movement was a social justice campaign that focused on improving Black people's access to decent jobs, housing, health care, and education. Black activists used the tactic of nonviolent direct action during protests, and the entire Black community used the tactic of armed self-defense when armed white terrorists entered the Black community to try to intimidate it. Consequently, the Cambridge movement and its leader, Gloria Richardson, were influential to Black power activists who adopted a similar framework of goals and tactics. When Richardson joined the Cambridge movement, she did so as a co-chair of an organization called the Cambridge Nonviolent Action Committee. Okay, so when you hear me say CNAC, C-N-A-C, CNAC stands for the Cambridge Nonviolent Action Committee. And when she joined CNAC, she did so as a co-chair of the organization's executive board. Okay, and that this organization was really that driving force behind the Cambridge movement. And the other co-chair of that organization was another woman who happened to be 19 years old at the time. At this point, Richardson was about 42 in 1962. She was like 40 at this point. So she's joined up with a 19-year-old woman, and the 2 of them are the co-chairs. Now, it's not hierarchical. They have 2 co-chairs because they're going to be the public face of the organization, but it's not a hierarchical organization like the Roman Catholic Church, where, where we work.
Right.
I mean, for Cabrini, it's a Roman Catholic.
Absolutely.
That's, top-down, leader-driven. CNAC was a member-driven, group-centered civil rights organization. So they did have co-chairs, but they didn't have a executive authority to veto anybody else's forward decision. And those 2 women, Richardson and the other co-chair, were actually among a group of women on this 12 to 15 member executive committee. And I think that this shows how far ahead of the rest of the nation that Cambridge's Black community was in terms of how they envisioned their path to liberation. Essentially, whoever could do the work was valued for the work, and it didn't matter what their gender was. So let's take a look at how Richardson actually becomes a civil rights leader. And leadership is a key part of why I wrote about Richardson. You can't talk about it. You'd be not telling a complete story about Richardson if you didn't actually talk about her as a leader, which is why she was known at the time around the United States and somewhat internationally as an actual civil rights leader, not just an activist, but as a leader. So according to, who's heard of Fannie Lou Hamer? Okay, so Fannie Lou Hamer, she's got a couple biographies out there, and one of her biographers wrote that people like Hamer and Miss Richardson and other women such as these folks, were able to propel themselves into significant roles in the civil rights movement because of two interrelated factors. One is the historical circumstance in which these people found themselves, and the second factor was that those people's personal qualities. So the circumstance in Richardson's case was the political vacuum that occurred in the black section of Cambridge, which was called the Second Ward, W-A-R-D, a geographically defined part of the city, okay, a racially segregated area, from the rest of the other 4 wards of Cambridge, which were all white. So Richardson's case occurred when the political vacuum occurred in the Second Ward because the black city councilman named Charles Cornish, he had lost the support of his constituents because they saw him as a gradualist, a politician who was okay for black liberation to occur, but he was okay for it on a timeline of gradually happening. And by the mid-1960s, most of black America is not okay with a gradualist timeline for black liberation. So his political downfall starts when black high school students actually started a desegregation campaign in Cambridge. And Gloria Richardson's daughter, her teenage daughter Donna, was among this group of student activists who started this desegregation push in Cambridge. So here's one of these, as historians, you know, I'm a trained historian, so is Daryl. I'm from Black Studies, he's from history, but in our world of historical scholarship, we call it a counterfactual argument. Well, what would have happened if those black students hadn't actually started that desegregation campaign in Cambridge? We don't know what would happen because it didn't happen that way. Right. What happened is they started this campaign, and we do know that what happens afterwards is that those students become demoralized and their spirit is essentially fractured because white politicians and some black gradualists in Cambridge say to the black students, if you stop demonstrating, we'll make sure things get better in Cambridge. We'll make sure desegregation happens. And what do we know what happens? When white people make these commitments, they're really hollow commitments and nothing actually happens. So the students had taken the white politicians and black moderate leaders at their word, and nothing actually happens. So then Richardson and other black parents actually step into this breach. And this is what ends up happening, is you have black adults in Cambridge, then they assume the role of driving this desegregation campaign, okay? But we know that without these black teenagers doing this activism, we may never have known I may never have been writing this biography about Gloria Richardson because maybe we never heard of her, okay?
And I would say the same way if what happened to the Scottsboro Boys hadn't happened. So teenagers, Rosa Parks might not be Rosa Parks.
That's a really good point, yeah. So yeah, if we take away these important elements and factors in these people's personal and political history, we may actually have never heard about Rosa Parks or Gloria Richardson. Okay, the outcome of history. Did you want to say something? Go ahead.
Is this the same story with Taraji P. Henson?
With who?
Taraji P. Henson. She's it's a movie coming out and she's playing somebody.
No, well, not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I didn't watch it. I mean, it didn't come out yet, but I seen the previews and it sounds from the previews. It sounds just like that Gloria Richardson.
She might actually be playing. I know there's a movie with her coming out as an important civil rights activist. I can't recall the name, but it's not Gloria Richardson, but it's somebody from that same time. Yeah. I want to think like it's not Fannie Lou Hamer, but it might be Daisy Bates or somebody else.
Kathy, look that up.
Yeah. Okay. Exactly. If you can find it, and just chime in. So the other factor in Richardson's rise to prominence, and you'll be able to piggyback off of this as well, Daryl, are those personal qualities. So for Gloria Richardson, she lived and worked according to ethical, humanistic principles that recognize people's inherent value and their obligation to try to improve their society. Furthermore, Richardson displayed strong character and leadership traits. Hi, come on in, have a seat. Richardson displayed strong character and leadership traits and an unwavering commitment to black liberation. In turn, these traits fostered support, loyalty, and trust from men and women both within Cambridge's Second Ward, Cambridge's black community, as well as black activists and some white student activists who came into Cambridge from the outside to help out. So, one activist from Howard University who had gone to Cambridge to help out said Richardson could be relied upon to carry out CNAC's decision. Her decisiveness was reassuring to him and to other activists because social change movements are inherently mercurial and they constantly challenge activists' commitment. Richardson also impressed some of the journalists who covered the Cambridge movement. John Britton was a writer for Ebony and Jet magazine during the 1960s. And I interviewed him for this book. I actually tracked him down and I called him and we talked on the phone. And he told me that he observed Richardson in action and he came away with the impression that she was, quote, a very sharp lady. Sharp in the sense that she had some political instincts about her, which is not all that common among people who were driven by some kind of ideology. But she had a political instinct and seemed to know when to do whatever and when not to do whatever, and yet still get her way, end quote. Her uncompromising approach to black liberation gave white politicos the impression that the black woman that Ebony magazine had described as the Lady General of civil rights was the freedom fighter who presented her white adversaries with the terms of their surrender to the Cambridge movement. Ebony's use of the adjective lady indicates that Richardson's gender distinguished her from the movement's other generals. And it is but one example of journalists' gendered interpretation of her activism. Throughout her time leading the Cambridge movement, journalists for both the black and white media mentioned Richardson's gender, her divorce, and her 2 children. Some reporters even mentioned her physique and her weight. Nevertheless, it was logical for journalists to highlight Richardson's gender because most national leaders were men, and she had challenged gendered concepts of leadership and power. She was therefore an interesting anomaly within that movement's leadership cadre. So it made sense they would make mention of her as being a woman, but it doesn't make sense that they would just mention, oh, what's her size, what's her weight, what's her height. They would actually make, she was I think Ebony said she was 137 pounds, and I was like, she's like, I was never 137 pounds. Meaning she didn't ever weigh that much, okay? But they really framed her in terms of this gendered, really what we nowadays call a sexist interpretation. And that, why are they mentioning her kids? Why are they mentioning that she's a divorcee, right? So, but basically, it made sense to mention her gender, at least in the specific category of numbers. She was a nationally recognized black leader when Fannie Lou Hamer may have been the real only other woman at that level seen nationally as a civil rights leader, but even she wasn't leading a local movement. She was important, and I'm not taking anything away from Miss Hamer, but in terms of an actual local struggle and a protracted one, Richardson was this recognized leader, and she ended up having a huge amount of power, political power nationwide, as seen as if you're in agreement with Gloria Richardson or she's agreeing with you, then you're doing something right. And more than a decade after her work in Cambridge, the civil rights activist and comedian Dick Gregory wrote in one of his autobiographies or memoirs, he wrote that Richardson was, in his words, quote, undoubtedly the strongest woman to emerge in the civil rights movement, end quote. And he developed that opinion by observing firsthand her humanistic approach to black liberation. And I interviewed Dick Gregory for this book as well. And when I spoke with him, he told me, quote, she didn't take nothing off of white people, and she didn't have a gun, and she wasn't talking about killing. She was talking about human dignity. And it took me a while to get used to that because I'd never seen a black woman with that type of persistence on liberation, end quote. For the entirety of the Cambridge movement, Gloria Richardson had completely outmaneuvered her white adversaries through the use of silence and misinformation when she interacted with them. She lied to them about whether CNAC would protest, and she would occasionally not respond to their statements or prompts during meetings. Importantly, these white people interpreted her silence as consent to the points that they had made, and they were surprised when Cenac went and did something that appeared to go against what Richardson had allegedly agreed to. What most people outside of Cambridge's black community did not understand about her is that Richardson did not speak unless she felt the need to do so. Furthermore, she was not in competition with anyone, so she felt no need to challenge people, even those who behaved as if they were entitled to speak on behalf of Cenac and the Cambridge movement. Overall, Richardson had used traditional and asymmetrical tactics to wage war for black liberation, and she confused white leaders at every turn. Stokely Carmichael, has anybody ever heard of Stokely Carmichael? Okay, so Stokely Carmichael observed the psychological effect Richardson's activism, the psychological effect her activism had on these people, because he had gone to Cambridge to help out. So he met Richardson in Cambridge, and that's where he cut some of his activist teeth, okay? And he had remarked that, in his words, quote, that she had, quote, drove the politicians crazy, end quote. Cambridge's city attorney admitted as much in an interview with New Republic magazine at the time, back in 1963. The attorney said, quote, "We can't deal with her, and we can't deal without her," end quote. An example of this frustration occurred when Richardson boycotted the referendum vote in the fall of 1963. So here's what happens. Cambridge's white community had initiated a referendum, small d democratic process, right? Mm-hmm. Entirely legal, to initiate a referendum to maintain racial segregation in public accommodations. And had the referendum been defeated, public accommodations would have been desegregated. Had the referendum been, maintained or upheld through people's votes, racial segregation would have been maintained or kept, because it already existed. So Richardson said that black people's constitutional rights are non-negotiable. They should never be put up for popular vote. So she boycotted the vote. And so did most of the black voters. Because to them, it may be a legally permissible process, a referendum, but when the majority is voting on the rights of the minority, that is an inherently illegitimate process, and that you should not participate in it. Because if you do, you actually legitimize white people's claim that black people's rights can be put up for popular vote. It also, incidentally, is exactly what the Founding Fathers warned us of in Federalist Paper number 51, about the tyranny of the majority, that it would abuse its power over the minority. So Richardson was keeping in very long traditional, small d democratic Founding Father philosophy of democracy, that if you allow the majority to actually exercise its voting power to determine the rights of the minority, they're going to always abuse the minority, okay, that numerical minority, right? This boycott really threw white and black moderates for a loop. They had argued that black people should vote every single time they had the opportunity to do so. The most common reason they used was that black people in the Deep South were fighting for the right to vote, so Cambridge's black voters should show solidarity with them by voting in the referendum. And Richardson disagreed with this logic, as I just mentioned. She said that the black rights should never be put up for popular vote, and to participate in it would legitimize the inherently racist political process that underlied the entire referendum process itself. In terms of class, socioeconomic status, Richardson supported everyone's right to participate in the movement, including the local man who had a reputation for public intoxication. This, and her knowledge that bread and butter issues, the lack of jobs, poor housing and health care, and lousy public education, that these issues were at the heart of black people's problems. And this telegraphed to the growing radical wing in the civil rights movement where their next battlefield would be, and they should be willing to use all tactics available to them, including a boycott of referendums or a block vote or an election boycott, actually boycotting elections, as well as using the armed self-defense as a tactic. And of course, this is what began to take place in the mid-1960s with the development of Black Power. And Gloria Richardson was seen by these younger activists as a model for leadership to push black liberation forward. So Daryl, can you talk about Ms. Parks' importance to the civil rights and black power movement in terms of who should participate and what leadership should look like?
I want to kind of tie in with this boycott of the referendum, right? So participation in that vote, as according to Ms. Richardson, participation in that vote would be sanctioning the rights of people to make determinations about black lives and black bodies.
Correct.
And in a lot of ways, this Montgomery bus boycott is linked to that, right? So the buses were segregated. Black people had to sit in the back of the bus. White riders could ride in the front of the bus. The back of the bus actually had a larger section in many of those buses than the front of the bus. But the fact that it was dictated to African Americans across the South, really, it was dictated to them that this is the only place where you can sit, was a problem for her. And it was a problem for the residents of Montgomery. And so rather than participate in this system that was a rigged system, and it was a system that really dictated the places black people could be, they just decided for 381 days they were going to boycott it.
They opted out.
They opted out. This is not, we can't control our own bodies and where we sit, we're not going to participate in the process. And so that really, links to this whole idea of the referendum, because people shouldn't be making decisions about what I can do or where I can sit or what I can do with my body. And Rosa Parks, I'm going to talk about leading up to and in the legacy, but Rosa Parks was sitting in the black section of the bus. It's just the white section had filled up, and the custom was that, or the law was that black people had to leave from the front of the black section to the back of the black section to stand and allow white people to sit in the black section. So it wasn't as if she was sitting, intentionally in a section where only white people could sit. She was sitting in her, if you will, quote unquote, proper place. It's just, it became not her proper place because there were too many white people on the bus. So they said, forget it. So in terms of who participates, and I really want to think about this idea of leadership. So Ms. Richardson, we're talking about 1960s, we're talking about really a rise in black power, we're talking about all kinds of other things that are happening in terms of feminine mystique and feminism in general, second wave of feminism, but also black feminism and the rise. Rosa Parks, we're talking about a decade earlier and some different things. So, like I said, Rosa Parks cut her teeth protesting the Scottsboro case. She then launched into, in the 40s, efforts to voter registration for African Americans. So she is one of these people that maybe these gradualists are talking about. Rosa Parks is fighting for voter registration in Alabama. And Rosa Parks joins the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. And she joins the Montgomery branch of the NAACP in early 1940s. And she's one of two female members of the NAACP. So women in Montgomery were kind of told, you need to stay at home. This is too dangerous for you. And Rosa Parks and to his credit, Raymond Parks, her husband, said, you know what? This is a fight for everybody, and I'm going to get into this fight. And in terms of leadership, she joins the NAACP, and she doesn't just join the NAACP branch in Montgomery, she joins as the secretary of the NAACP branch in Montgomery. So she takes on an immediate leadership position with the NAACP. She works very closely with the president at the time, a guy by the name of E.D. Nixon, and she collaborates and drives some of these efforts. And when she doesn't give up this seat on the bus, it's not the first time she hadn't given up her seat.
Right.
And she's not the first person in Montgomery to have not given up her seat. But she knew that it was enough. And there's actually, so Rosa Parks has a bust in the rotunda of the Capitol building. It's the first African American to be in the Capitol building. And it happened during the Obama administration. And when President Obama was making this speech and the unveiling of the bus, he talks about how Rosa Parks was tired. And Rosa Parks said, she has said previously, because she was deceased at that time, she wasn't tired. She wasn't physically tired. She was tired of segregation. She was tired of oppression. She was tired of business as usual, things as usual. And so they were fighting and protesting that. And so Rosa Parks is this icon. We think about Rosa Parks as this icon of the civil rights movement, but when we think about people as icons, and we need heroes and we need icons, and we do that. And it's kind of, it breeds a sense of nationalism, it breeds a sense of, culture and heritage and those things like that. But when we think of Rosa Parks in terms of this icon, we really take a snapshot of Rosa Parks. And Rosa Parks was an activist from her 20s on. She was in her 40s when she didn't give up her seat on the bus. She moved to Detroit and continued her activism in Detroit. And she was not just a snapshot of a woman who didn't get off of her seat on the bus. She wasn't a tired woman. She wasn't a humble woman. She wasn't a meek woman. She was a woman who wanted to stand up for her rights. And I think there's a lot of parallels then in terms of Miss Richardson, even though they grew up or came of age in different time periods. And I'll just kind of give you a quote from Rosa Parks. So when she moves to Detroit after the bus boycott, she evolved in her views of Black liberation. So, and articulated those evolutions in her views of Black liberation. So she's not a snapshot person. After moving to Detroit, her beliefs shifted to encompass much more of a Black power stance. And so she has actually a quote from here. She says, and I quote, "Dr. King used to say that Black people should receive brutality with love," right? And that's that kind of nonviolent direct action, Gandhian,
Turn the other cheek.
Turn the other cheek, right? And it's very much grounded in kind of the conversation of Jesus and how Jesus responds to things. But Rosa Parks saw another version or another type of Jesus, the Jesus that actually went into the temple and threw out the money changers, right? So you don't have to be without emotion to be religious, right? In fact, a lot of times you can live your religion, particularly liberation theology, through your emotions. And so she says, Dr. King used to say that Black people should receive brutality with love, but I couldn't reach that point in my mind at all. So Rosa Parks wasn't about meeting brutality with love. She was about meeting brutality with whatever was necessary in order to defeat that brutality, in order to fight for Black liberation. So.
Well, I think.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
So.
Good to see you, by the way.
Yeah, so, forgive my ignorance here, but so I guess I kind of remember hearing that, for some reason in my mind, that Rosa Parks didn't intend necessarily when she first. Mm-hmm. And then, but I was surprised to hear you say that's not the first time she had done it or had. So what was it that made this such a big galvanizing event? If this is just something that maybe not all the time, but.
Yeah, she was actually the fifth person that year arrested for not giving up their seat on the bus. She happened to be the secretary of the NAACP chapter. She was a trusted friend of the president, E.D. Nixon. And when she got arrested, she actually, her phone call was to E.D. Nixon, not to Raymond Parks, her husband. And she called and basically said it happened because they knew she was going to be a good model. She was going to be a good front person for the efforts that were happening. There were already cases that were pending in the court system, 4 other cases pending in the court system where people were protesting segregation, and a woman by the name of Claudette Colvin, a young woman by the name of Claudette Colvin, was going to be the test case, but in these gendered terms, she was pregnant and she was not married. And so image has a lot to do with things, and Rosa Parks was the perfect image. But the case that overturned segregation, the Supreme Court case, is actually Browder v. Gale. And there are 4 defendants in Browder v. Gale. One of them is Aurelia Browder. And so she's the Claudette Colvin is also named in the case. And Rosa Parks is not named in the case. So look, Rosa Parks never brought suit against the transportation system for segregating her, but she was the person, she is and was the person you remember. Yeah, but there was a desire for Rosa Parks to be arrested. I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think that the general conversation, historically, but also practically speaking in terms of practical tactics, is, how do you go about leveraging a community, an actual community's resources, money, talent, time, and commitment, and how do you build commitment? So Richardson has said that in Cambridge it took about 18 months to actually build a movement that was sustainable, that could actually have enough inertia to keep moving forward, even despite a lack of progress. But that it took really about 15 months, it was about 18 months, that at certain points things crystallized within the community, okay? And come on in. So certain things crystallized within the community, and in Cambridge, the crystallizing event was that a bunch of teenage students had been brutalized by police during a laying in the aisles of a local movie theater. And because of the police brutality against these teenagers, as I write in Gloria Richardson's biography, all of the remaining holdouts in the black community had been convinced, it's time to get on board, because the cops had crossed a line. So there was still, in Parks' case, the community was already prepared for this kind of activism, but it was a matter of what's the flashpoint? What's going to be the thing that actually drives, is a catalyst for a broader thing to happen? So in Montgomery, it's Parks, but there had already been an actual community-based infrastructure built by the Women's Political Council, WPC, which was an all-black women's organization, and that the day that Rosa Parks got arrested, which was a Friday, December 1st, one of the members of the organization taught at a historically black college in Montgomery, and she and a couple students printed up 50,000 flyers for the one-day boycott to occur the next Monday. Okay.
Yeah, it was Friday, but to occur on Monday.
Exactly, because that's when Rosa Parks was going to be, her trial was set. So there were black women organizers and the local NAACP, and Parks did not belong to the Women's Political Council.
No, she did not.
She did belong to that black women's organization, but because there was a lot of crossover membership, that everybody knew who Parks was. Everybody knew that she got arrested. So there was already infrastructure in place and people with resources, talent, and time to kick this off. And across that weekend, all the black churches said there's going to be a one-day boycott that Monday. So and whites had no clue because whites don't know black people.
Well, and these conversations are all happening within black
spaces.
Black spaces, yeah. Which is that's the importance of fraternal organizations, of black churches, of all of these groups that then can come together. HBCUs, all of these groups where black people can have their own space and their own conversations. And really, but yeah, you're right. That was the flashpoint. The tension was building and building and building, and it was Rosa Parks. When Rosa Parks, it's everybody knows her and says, you can do this to this person, but when you mess with that person, it's just too much.
Yeah. So, and what we're talking about essentially comes down to how do you, and this is all about today's human rights organizing for Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black Lives, Black Youth 100, whether it be about anti-globalization or the climate crisis. Everything is that, how do you as an activist and as a member of an activist interact with each other? Okay, do you have solidarity with each other, and are you encrypting your flash drives, or are you encrypting your text messages, because we're all being spied on, right? In other words, the use of silence and misinformation within the black liberation struggle is still going on today. okay? And it always has been necessary because those that want to prevent or thwart black liberation are going to be very creative in those attempts, and black people already know that they have to outthink and outsmart the white supremacists. So these things that Richardson and her colleagues and comrades in the movement in Cambridge and Parks and her comrades and colleagues in Montgomery, all we have to do is replicate them with a 21st century technology approach and understanding. But one thing's for sure, and this is something that local activists today still need to remember and employ, is that grassroots activism isn't done through Twitter or Instagram or anything else. It's knocking on doors. It's actually going to community events and what we would call, in the olden days, pressing the flesh. And that's how a movement begins and is sustained and is maintained through loyalty and dedication. And that, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and anything else can be an aid to organizing and an aid to communication.
And also an aid to misinformation.
Right, and that it's not the end all.
Yeah.
It still comes down to knocking on doors and showing up, but also understanding that Parks, while she belonged to a hierarchical organization, the NAACP, and what the Montgomery branch did was directed by the main office in New York. There's a purpose for hierarchy, and it works well for many things, but not everything. And Rosa Parks also engaged in political protests that were group-centered, member-driven, like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Yeah.
Who's heard of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC? Okay, so those are group-centered, member-driven organizations that really emphasize consultation and consensus. If we're all in a room here and we belong to the same organization, we're going to talk about what we want to do and we're going to vote on it. And not one of us is going to get a veto over anybody else. We'll talk, we'll consult, and we'll come to a consensus. And the majority votes wins. And we'll all live with that. And then we're going to make mistakes, but we'll learn from them. But it's not going to be a hierarchical thing that's dictatorial, because that's not actually what changes society. What has changed this country are the grassroots, group-centered, member-driven organizing that's occurred throughout black liberation here in the U.S.
I was wondering what year that was that Gloria Richardson led that boycott, and also was there contact between some of those organizations, like the Cambridge Movement, SNCC, or other movements? And also, did you interview Stokely, I call him Kwame Ture, for your book?
I'll start with Mr. Carmichael. No, I didn't interview him. He died in 1999, I think. 98, January 98, I think it was.
I have known him. So.
Right, and I didn't meet him. I didn't meet Gloria Richardson until 2002. Okay. So the boycott was October of 1963 of the referendum.
Okay.
And because CNAC, the Cambridge Nonviolent Action Committee, it was an adult affiliate of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So, which is member-driven, group-centered, non-hierarchical. Yeah. So SNCC didn't have any veto power over CNAC. CNAC had no veto power over SNCC. The Maryland chapter of the NAACP was really bothered by the boycott of the vote, because nationally they had taken a position that whenever black people had the right to vote, they should vote, because philosophically practically they were attempting to get, the majority of black people still lived in the American South at that time. They were trying to get those people to be able to have the right to vote. So they figured it was this, solidarity thing. And Richardson said, no, that's a red herring argument. So yes, there was a major disagreement between CNAC and the NAACP, both statewide and nationally. And she didn't care, because every black liberation will occur in every community, at the community level. Black liberation doesn't occur in Washington or on Mars. Black liberation occurs on Germantown Ave in Philly, on Ardmore Ave in Bryn Mawr. It occurs on the street. by local activists making those qualitative improvements to their lives in the here and now, not some abstract thing, 2,000 miles away, or, in Washington, D.C., 300 miles away, or whatever, however far it is. So, but there's a role for the NAACP, because without them, we don't have the elimination of the white primary in the 1940s, where the Supreme Court decides that all white primaries, election primaries, are illegal. We don't have Brown versus Board of Education Topeka. We don't have the elimination of restrictive covenants in housing. Without the NAACP using the legal mechanism, the judiciary branch of the federal government, to drive for change, we don't have a lot of progress. So there's a role for that. But philosophically, the NAACP tried to intimidate, politically that is, Cambridge. And Richardson wasn't having it, and neither was the rest of Black Cambridge. And that's also a sign to the racial moderates within Black America that somebody who can't be bought out and co-opted, and she's in her mid-40s, and she's not the Black middle class. Richardson's family was so wealthy, her grandfather was a city council member, Black city council member in Cambridge, because like I said earlier, Blacks had the right to vote in Cambridge and in Maryland since the end of Reconstruction, since Reconstruction. So Richardson's family was so wealthy, they were above the middle class. They were what we call the Black elite, which is how many Black families? Well, if you know of the Mary Church Terrell, that kind of Black wealth from Memphis, we're talking about Senator Edward Brooke, who was the senator of Massachusetts. He was Black, but he's originally from Washington, D.C. He was a classmate of Richardson's at Howard. We're talking about people with so much money. Richardson's grandfather, the Black man, was loaning white people in Cambridge money. Her family was so wealthy, they loaned white people money. That's how wealthy this family was. She couldn't care less what white people wanted or thought. For her, Black rights are non-negotiable. You don't vote on Black rights. That's why you boycott the vote. And if you think that you should be voting on Black people's rights, all you do is perpetuate the problem. So that's philosophically, politically, her philosophy. And then what you start to see is now we would call that radical, but one could argue the Founding Fathers warned us against that. So is it really that radical? Mm-hmm. But in terms of how we understand Black history, when you take that position, you become a radical, don't you? And when you advocate the right of armed self-defense like she did, she's militant. Did Rosa Parks advocate the right of armed self-defense for Black people?
She did.
She did. And we never talk about that when it comes to Rosa Parks, right? She's this.
Well, she's the pristine kind of passive act. She's ideal. She's passive, but she's not.
She's been depoliticized. Right. The icon of Rosa Parks is depoliticized.
That's the snapshot. That's a snapshot of her sitting on the bus in February of 1962. We've returned back to peace, and Rosa Parks did her part, and thank God there's Martin Luther King Jr., and we don't talk about any of the people that are in the background, largely women in the background, driving people around, coordinating carpools, cooking food, printing flyers, all the things that are happening in order for people to stay off the bus for 381 days. We don't think about or talk about that because, there's a lot of reasons. And
driving the communication networks. I mean, literally within that, in Cambridge it was called the grapevine. Mm-hmm. So they had this information sharing process within the Black community that white people had no clue about.
And misinformation.
And then strategically giving misinformation to white politicians. And some Black people spying on other Black people who they knew, as Miss Richardson said, were running downtown to talk to white people. Mm-hmm. So the Black community knew who they could trust within their own community. They were keeping tabs on the ones they knew were trying to undermine the movement because those Black people had been concerned about, cozying up to white people. So these are things we all learn about, even in 21st century, when it comes to the federal government spying on us, but also the attempts by white supremacists to undermine Black liberation. We are still confronting the same problems today, but it's in a slightly different way because of technology. But the overall operational means of becoming free has stayed essentially the same. And that's the lesson I want I wrote The Struggle is Eternal. I wrote this book literally as a guidebook for today's activists to read Richardson's story to say, I should keep this in mind. I'll tweak it for what I need here in the 21st century, but this framework that Richardson used, I can use this as well. Modify it for my own local needs, but this is how I can replicate it, okay? That's why I wrote that. That's why I wrote this book, and that's what I hope you all get out of it.
Yeah.